sees the strong benefits associated with simple structures, but complicated structured credits are too amenable to misuse. Accordingly, we propose to reduce the constraints on investing in obviously safe securitization paper, balanced by substantial disincentives to invest in less safe and less understandable instruments. APRA's work on the investment side of securitization will necessarily be guided by the Basel Committee's rules text. As most of you here would know, the Basel Committee is currently consulting on securitization, and they will likely come up with amended rules text in 2014. So let's go through a few of these things now. I'm going to shift gear from history and philosophy and all that, and really we'll give you a bit of a menu tour of individual themes which many of you will have an interest in. Let me insert a caveat here that everything you see today and everything we discuss later is subject to revision as we move to issuing a discussion paper and then the eventual ultimate new APS 120. For funding-only securitizations, we consider a two-class structure makes the most sense. The A class, pari passu in credit terms, and as a practical matter, likely to be all AAA rated, may contain a number of tranches, including bullets and pass-throughs. The B class, in a funding-only arrangement, would be a single instrument, in which essentially the entirety of the credit risk associated with the underlying assets is concentrated. This instrument will be held in its entirety by the originator. The current 20% holding limit on instruments would be rescinded, and we propose to allow a date-based cleanup call. We do not propose to allow other date-based calls on the basis that this option to the issuer too easily becomes a de facto obligation on the issuer instead of an option. In sum, this arrangement will allow issuers to take a quite simple approach to raising funds against an amortizing asset pool. Let's now move to master trust, those vehicles which seem to possess a near mythical attraction for some in this market. In fact, it's like master trust. Oh, if only we could do master trust, all our problems would be solved. I've been in this business for a very long time now, and when any time someone says all my problems would be solved, you start to worry. But anyway, our proposal here is we don't ban master trust now, and we will allow master trust, but not if they're de facto covered bonds. The core issue here is that the so-called seller's share in a master trust cannot become the equivalent of excess collateral in a covered bond vehicle. This means, among other things, that the seller's share must rank at least equal to the most senior instruments in the structure. Master trust will allow soft bullet arrangements, but APRA will be concerned to ensure that these arrangements are not so firm that the originator is on the hook for repayment if the asset pool is insufficient to the task. Having established the foundation for funding-only structures, it is straightforward to move to securitization for capital relief. In a structure with a single Class B instrument, the capital relief is simply the proportion of the instrument irrevocably sold, subject to a skin-in-the-game cap of 80% capital relief, or inversely 20% minimum capital retention. In the past year, we've listened to the industry and its representations that limiting securitization to a single B class is too restrictive. Accordingly, and I must confess not altogether enthusiastically, we propose to allow multiple classes of subordinated notes, which need not be pari passu. Capital relief, however, is limited to the class of subordinated notes that is most retained by the originator. That's going to need an example. So here are two examples to illustrate the point, both presuming 3 credit levels within the B class. In the first example, the skin-in-the-game floor does not apply. The minimum sold proportion is Class B2 at 30%, so the allowable risk-weighted asset reduction is 30%. In the second example, over 80% of each subordinated class is sold, so the 80% risk-weighted asset reduction floor would apply. The combination of these proposals means that an ADI originators and RMBS structures should be able to fund up to about 98% of their liquidity needs and 80% of their capital needs through securitization. A number of people have pointed out to us that the current arrangements allow 100 and 100, and yes, we are sufficiently well educated to understand that 98 and 80 are less than 100 and 100. That is the intended outcome. Per my earlier comments about perpetual motion machine, one of the things we learned from the GFC is you don't want people thinking there's a free lunch in the sense of I can do something without funding and without capital. So that big lesson figures in what we're proposing to do here. On the liquidity front, and unlike the current prudential arrangements, we propose to more explicitly integrate ADI liquidity with the securitization framework. The Basel III liquidity arrangements, Basel III liquidity arrangements split between larger ADIs, mainly banks, that must model net cash outflows and apply the liquidity coverage ratio test, and smaller ADIs, mainly mutually owned, that must meet a simpler threshold based on the minimum liquidity holdings, the so-called MLH test. For ADIs subject to the LCR, cash flows associated with securitization vehicles will figure in the net cash outflow calculation, with outflow assumed from the earliest date possible under relevant calls or similar arrangements. Put another way, there's no separation on the liquidity balance sheet. And so securitization will be managed in the context of the overall LCR position. For smaller ADIs on the MLH liquidity arrangements, a simpler approach will apply. What we're proposing to do is say if you've termed out the liability, then that's not on your 9% requirement, but if it's sub 1 year, it will be in your requirement. ADIs will be allowed to trade in Class A instruments, including their own instruments. It is possible for ADIs to take advantage of this arrangement to create market expectations that they're issuing hard bullets in a funding-only securitization. APRA also forms market expectations, and should we form the view that an ADI is gaming the trading in its own paper, the ability to do so might become limited. For banks establishing a committed liquidity facility with the RBA, the all reasonable steps test will apply to securitization, in the same way this expectation already applies to banks issuing unsecured term liabilities and covered bonds. That is, banks with substantial home loan pools are in a good position to issue funding only, or for that matter, capital relief securitizations, and they will be expected to do so in order to further increase the tenor of their wholesale liabilities. Warehouses. APRA has considered a great many issues associated with securitization warehouses. Every time we set out to write a rule about all this, that rule got to be longer than the rest of the draft APS 120 put together. So we said, no, that approach is not going to work. So what our inclination is to allow originators and warehouse providers to continue with warehouses more or less on the current capital effects, provided that the underlying assets are term funded within a year. Past 1 year, such arrangements will be treated as a whole loan sale by the originator to the warehouse provider. Most of APRA's securitization arrangements focus on issuers. On the other side of the balance sheet, exposures to securitized assets may comprise a material part of some ADI's assets. As noted previously, the Basel Committee is expected to issue an additional standard in this area during 2014. APRA's reformed prudential standards will at least implement the Basel Committee's minimum requirements. One lesson APRA has taken from the GFC is that senior paper in a simple securitization arrangement is very likely to be sound paper. And we're comfortable that ADIs could hold such assets under the relevant risk weightings flowing from the Basel Committee, which currently start at 7%. By contrast, APRA's tolerance for subordinated exposures and for apparently senior instruments with underlying complexity, such as CDOs, squares, cubed, quadrupled, has greatly reduced. Accordingly, we propose a simple rule. ADIs holding the most senior class in a conventional securitization will receive the Basel risk weight. And as a practical matter, are blessings to do what they like in either the trading or the banking book. Our current thinking, however, is that holdings in any subordinated securitization arrangement, or any holdings at all, including senior and anything that looks like a CDO square, would attract a CET1 deduction. In any event, holdings in another ADI's B notes will clearly attract a CET1 deduction. APRA is more comfortable that our less levered investors, such as super funds and most insurance companies, could bear the losses from subordinated and complex securitization structures. So we're not proposing to expand the CET1 deduction treatment to those industries. There's a trade-off essentially between lack of knowledge and lack of leverage. This proposed approach to investments is rather firmer than has been taken in some other jurisdictions. It is consistent with our view that simple securitization structures are likely to be valuable, but this value essentially evaporates under complex arrangements. There are a great many other issues, which I will touch on briefly here. Feel free to ask questions later, but all this will be covered in the discussion paper. We've had a number of representations on multi-seller structures. There are two large problems with multi-seller structures. One, right now they're not very big, and so hence not a big part of any solution that we're looking for. And secondly, it is very hard to figure out how to have a simple but effective skin in the game arrangements. Either you end up with something very complex or something that divorces each originator's results from the results of that originator's part of the asset pool. So we're going to invite the industry to solve that conundrum for us. If you can't, we will very likely say in the APS-120 that it doesn't cater for multi-seller structures. On asset-backed commercial paper, we propose to allow that, as we do now. Most likely, that will be funding only, and with a particular caveat. That caveat is that any originator raising short-term funds through securitization vehicles must be able to demonstrate that it can carry the portfolio through a 2-year market shutdown. So this is one of the things we learned from the GFC. And this ties into the idea that the contractual maturity of the short assets might be quite short, but the underlying business could be quite a lot longer. So if you look, for example, at credit cards, you can say, oh, well, each individual exposure is short term, but the business